Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half an hour, we'll see what's making headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the political commentator Benedict Spence. So let's see what's on some of those front pages, and we'll start with the front of the Telegraph, which leads with a warning from the French energy company EDF that it may have to shut down two of the older UK nuclear plants it runs next year as a result of the windfall tax on its profits, which the firm says made the cost of keeping those plants going prohibitive. Fuel bills make the front of the Mail on Sunday. This is the Scottish edition, which says UK households are paying billions extra in a stealth tax to fund the bailout of collapsed energy firms. The Sunday Express carries an exclusive interview with the Prime Minister, promising better times ahead with what he calls a New Year master plan to kickstart the economy. The Sunday Times leads with new research suggesting wavering voters could still switch to the Tories at the next election. The Sunday People reports that pressure on the NHS means patients are dying before they ever get a hospital bed. The Mirror says that former Royal Aide Lady Hussey, who resigned after asking a UK-born charity boss where she was really from, is to get an invitation to King Charles's coronation. Lady Hussey has apologised for that incident, while the Star continues its campaign to help the country's pubs recover from the economic crisis by asking people to forsake dry January and sign up to what it's calling the thirst of January. And a reminder that by scanning that QR code you see on your screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of the papers while you watch along with us. Now, we're joined tonight by the journalist and author Christina Patterson and by the political commentator Benedict Spence. Christina, Benedict, happy New Year's Eve to you both. And let's get straight into this and go to the front page of the Sunday Times. Benedict, let's start with you on this. And this is the Times saying there's some new in-depth reporting saying that Labour lead in the polls may not be quite as firm as some would like it to be.
Yes, and this is, I suppose, trying to give, as it says, giving Tories fresh hope as they go into a new year and hope to banish the ghosts of 2022 firmly behind them. And it has been a particularly riotous year, I suppose, if you are the Conservative Party. Given that we've all been talking for a very long time about how it's likely that the Tories are likely to lose the next general election, and it's a question of by how many rather than if, perhaps this will come as welcome news to the Conservatives. And it's based on the idea that there are an awful lot of floating voters and undecided voters around the country at the moment, and it cites the Red Wall as part of that, and the idea that these things can still be clawed back. It also cites the idea of the shy Tory, which is something that I don't think is necessarily as big a factor as some would like it to be, but nonetheless it tries to paint the idea that all is not lost for Rishi Sunak. Now, I do happen to agree with that slightly, that all is not lost, and I would simply point to the seismic lead that Boris Johnson had over Keir Starmer this time 2 years ago, and how quickly that turned on its head, to say that strange things can happen in politics. But I do think that there is a lot of this is quite wishful thinking. I think, as everybody who pays any attention to politics knows, you lose elections because your core base and your undecideds don't turn out for you. And just because people are undecided right now in large numbers, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily going to go to the voting booths and hold their nose and vote Conservative in 2 years' time. I still think it's a mammoth battle that Rishi Sunak has on his hand. And I think it's very interesting that the end of this story then lists a number of things that Rishi Sunak is planning to do in the new year in order to fix the mess that the previous Conservative governments have left us with. And I think actually that spells it all. There are a lot of people who are undecided, but that doesn't mean that the government has a particularly good rap sheet to provide for these people come the next election. Yeah, that list is quite long and extensive. And Christina, I wonder what you make of the reporting here. I mean, there's a line in it that says Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, warning Keir Starmer not to stray away from centre ground policies.
Well, I think Peter Mandelson's absolutely right about that. And I think this polling is a kind of salutary reminder to kind of Liberal Remainers like me that Keir Starmer is probably right to stick to the centre ground that he has been sticking to the point where he is saying not only is he not going to make any attempts to reverse Brexit, which he has said he wouldn't do anyway, but also that he's not looking at renegotiating the relationship with the EU, which is very, very unpopular with many Labour voters. But he understands, and this poll reminds us, that he cannot win power without winning over the red wall. These are the seats that he has to win, and these people were traditionally Labour voters, but all ideas of what was traditional and what isn't have disappeared in recent years, and they are very socially conservative. I do think one area where Labour are going to have trouble in wooing these voters is the whole trans issue, actually, because there are still certain areas where Labour is very much not in tune with the electorate. But broadly speaking, I think what will blow all this polling apart is that next year, sadly, and I don't want to be saying this on New Year's Eve of all days, but I think it is going to be a very tough year for people economically. I think mortgages are going to be very high. People renegotiating mortgages are going to be facing costs of perhaps up to £3,000 a year. Energy bills are going to remain high, the cost of living is going to remain high, and failing a miracle, the war in Ukraine is going to continue and pressure on energy is going to continue. So I think actually ultimately the economy stupid is going to be what sways things, and I think that's what will mean that Keir Starmer will probably win power. But I think he has a lot more work to do in convincing the electorate of why they should vote for him, other than that he's not a Tory.
Yeah, and no need to apologise for the gloom we're perhaps facing next year, Christina. It's hard to avoid, isn't it? And speaking of which, let's stay with you and look at the front page of the Sunday People now. And this is reporting of the state of the NHS and emergency care. You may have seen our report earlier about ambulances queuing outside a hospital in Stoke-on-Trent. And this reporting says, as the headline there tells us, patients die before they're even getting a bed.
Sorry, is this for...
Yes, sorry, that's for you, Christina. My apologies.
Oh,
yes.
right, sorry. Yes. Well, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to add more gloom here because, the NHS is in a terrible state, and we're hearing awful reports of people waiting. There's a story of one person who had to wait 99 hours to get a bed. There are people waiting on the floors and corridors in A&E, and unfortunately, for example, they're running out of portable oxygen in lots of hospitals. There are critical incidents in lots of hospitals, very high rates of COVID, very high rates of flu, and just an NHS that is creaking at the seams. And I think, and nobody's currently striking. So this is without strikes. I think this is going to be, another kind of swing factor for voters, because at the moment, I think anyone who goes near the NHS can see it's really not coping. And that is, without the fact that staff are underpaid and, in my view, rightly needing pay rises. But it's just, there are not enough staff, there's not enough money, the whole thing is just not properly resourced. And I think if the Tories don't solve that, which I'm afraid they're unlikely to, then that's another reason I think they probably won't win the next election.
And Benedict, bringing you in there, I guess this speaks to that first story, doesn't it? The challenge facing Rishi Sunak if he's to win people over. And we haven't got the front page here, but the Express, he writes an article there talking about, good times to come. And I do wonder if the NHS is part of this plan to try and turn things around.
Yes, I did think that was a bit audacious of Rishi Sunak to basically write an op-ed on the front page of the Express going, things can only get better. But I think it adds to the sort of the sense of malaise that I think Christina and I are probably going to be projecting through the screen on New Year's Eve. And that's because I think that there is a real timidity around both political parties actually in this country. But we have to sort of, start with the Conservatives because they are the ones that have been in power for 12 years. Really, I think the British public are not stupid. They're not children. There has been this idea, this myth, I think, has carried on for a long time that you cannot touch the NHS. The NHS is the sacred cow. It's the state religion, and nothing can be done to criticize it, and nothing can be done to change it. But we see year after year after year, and it was the same actually under Labour to a lesser degree, but has certainly been exacerbated under the Tories. It is creaking. It is not fit for purpose. I think a Prime Minister needs to come along and say, look, the way that we fund it, the way that it is set up, the amount of money that we pay for it, how many places we make available for people to become doctors and nurses at universities, almost every echelon of this institution, which is the third most staffed institution on the planet after Walmart and the Chinese military. None of this is working as it should be. And actually, we have to be honest with ourselves and say we have an aging population. We are all becoming poorer. We're going to have to think of different ways to fund this in order to make sure that it does get the money, but also to make sure that it is more efficient. Now, I don't think that that's the US system. Nobody thinks that that's the US system because, of course, that's always the thing that everybody says, oh, it's going to be privatized like they have in America. It is perhaps the one thing, actually, I think that we have failed to do, both I suppose if you want to take it down that line, Brexiteers, Remainers, if there was one thing that you're going to take from Europe that has been sort of magnificent above all else, it is that in Europe they have lots of fantastic healthcare systems, and the UK steadfastly continues to fail to learn from this. There are other options, and we need a bold government to make this generational change.
Yeah, bold new thinking. I think you're calling for there, Benedict. All right, let's just keep moving on. We haven't got much time, but I want to get to the front page of the Telegraph now, and it's not specifically about the strikes in the NHS, Benedict, but it's about strikes more broadly. Tell us about this reporting here, because we've had talk from Rishi Sunak that he's going to crack down on striking workers, but this reporting suggests that it could be a good few months away.
Yes, and I think that is sensible, actually, because I don't think that you want to be presenting yourself as unnecessarily hostile to striking workers, especially as we've touched upon people working in the NHS who everybody agrees have been underpaid for a very long time. But I do also think that there's an element of cynicism to this, which is that the longer you sort of draw it out, you can perhaps bank on the idea, given that almost everybody in society is becoming poorer and is struggling, both private and public sector, you can sort of rely or hope that members of the private sector and the general public at large will begin to lose sympathy for the strikers. That has certainly happened with the rail strikers. They had a lot more support than they currently do. I'm not sure if that'll be the case for nurses. I think nurses will always retain an element of sympathy, but it might happen for, say, teachers or other areas of the public sector that may go on strike. And then at that point, Rishi Sunak will come in with the slightly more measured response of making sure that there are minimum staffing levels. Whether or not that's fair, I'm not sure, but it's certainly a far more sensible idea than I think the original Liz Truss plan, which was just to make it a lot more difficult for some industries to strike at all, which, as with everything under Liz Truss, was just generally a bit of a car crash. So at least, there is a semblance of sense there in Rishi Sunak. But nonetheless, nobody likes the idea of the erosion of the right to strike, because it is a fundamental principle of you being able to withdraw your labour to improve your terms. And if working conditions are dangerous and underpaid, as they are in some sectors in this country, you should be allowed to do that. And a government shouldn't be putting you in a position where you feel you have to strike.
OK. And Christina, just a quick thought from you then on that. I mean, the 6 months also is, I guess, the time when some of these striking workers will be balloted again about continuing their strike action.
Yes. I mean, I think the reason for the delay is actually more because there are likely to be objections to it than that Rishi Sunak wants to delay it for 6 months. I think the House of Lords, the piece says that the House of Lords is quite likely to object in all kinds of ways, and I don't blame them. But I think the real issue here is that the government is absolutely refusing to negotiate with the striking workers by pretending that it can't give 19% pay rises, for example, to nurses. Now, I think 19% pay rise was a tactical error from the nurses. They should not have asked for something so high, but everyone knows that strikes are about negotiation, and the fact that the government is refusing to negotiate is disastrous. And I think the big question will be who can win in terms of who will be blamed for these strikes. Will it be the striking workers, for example, the nurses, or will it be the government? At the moment, I think the government is being blamed more than the strikers, and the question is, will that shift over the next few months? And I hope that the nurses win this one. I have less sympathy for some of the other workers, but I think nurses have been consistently underpaid, and I think the government playing hardball in this way, it's losing the PR battle as well as what, in my view, is right.
OK, Christina, Benedict, appreciate that. Run out of time in this section, but we'll have more from you later. Thanks for being with us. Now, nuclear power plants could face shutdowns over the tax on their windfall profits. That is the story that's making the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, and we'll discuss that and much more after this break. You're watching the press preview with us, the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the political commentator Benedict Spence, for a look at the front pages as they arrive. Right, let's go through them. Benedict, Christina, thanks for staying with us. Let's get straight on because we haven't got much time in this half, but let's start with the Sunday Telegraph now, and that story that I was just talking about before we went to break. This is EDF saying that they could shut down some of the nuclear plants that they run here because of the windfall tax. Christina, just tell us about the reporting in this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reminder that absolutely every policy has its equal and opposite response. And of course, everybody was yelling for a windfall tax, in my view, rightly, because it's absolutely ridiculous that they've been making these vast profits. Well, we've been struggling so much with ridiculously high bills, and many people are literally having to choose between heating and eating. But EDF, who run all 5 nuclear power stations in this country, have said they may have to discontinue 2 of them in 2024 if this windfall tax continues at this rate. And that could leave us dangerously short of electricity. And that's, our kind of safety net really is in those 2 power stations. If that goes, that's our safety net gone, which is very, very dangerous at a time of a global energy crisis such as the one we have at the moment. So it is a worry for the government. And I must say, I mean, I think they were right to introduce an a windfall tax. It was, of course, Labour's idea, Rachel Reeves' idea, which the Tories eventually, having objected to it, copied. But it does show how very difficult the process of governing is, that everything you do has, seems to have, a sort of can have a disastrous effect. So, I really don't envy them for having to make these decisions.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough one. And Benedict, what did you make of it? I mean, when I first read this, it sort of reminded me of last week and ExxonMobil pushing back against the EU tax on their profits as well. Are we seeing sort of these big providers, these big companies pushing back on that idea?
I think what all of this has done, and this will actually increasingly, I think, be the case amongst a lot of Tory voters, is push the idea that actually the country should be looking to nationalise parts of its energy industry, if not all of it. And we talk about how the war in Ukraine has sort of spiked energy prices over the last couple of months. You need to look at who the big winners have been from this entire energy crisis. There have been state energy monopolies, such as Gazprom in Russia or Aramco in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. If you have the monopoly on supply of energy and you have the resources under your feet to your advantage, then the world is your oyster. It can be very useful, and it doesn't need to be the case that things become incredibly expensive. It's not the case in the Gulf or North Africa. It's not the case in Russia or Scandinavia that energy has massively surged necessarily because they control access to it. Now, in this country, we actually have the Holy Trinity. We still have an awful lot of fossil fuels that we could utilize should we choose to. We have an awful lot of renewable energy resources should we choose to. We can also build nuclear power stations in lots of areas. And we found ourselves outsourcing everything and turning off the taps to certain sources of energy. It is a failure of energy policy in this country going back decades. Yeah,
I think people will be surprised that they're reminded that we don't own the nuclear plants in this country. All right, let's move on to the front of the Sunday Times. And actually, the story, of course, is featured on most of the front page. This is about the Pope, Christina, and the passing of Pope Benedict XVI. And a big moment for the papacy, and also now sort of calls into question what happens next with the other Pope, who is looking kind of unwell in that picture.
Yes, well, it's not an industry, it's not an area that discriminates in favour of youth, is it? And so there is a kind of built-in obsolescence to the whole idea. And of course, Pope Benedict will go down in history being famous, really, for being the only Pope for hundreds of years to have resigned while still in office. I think look, he was a kind of, in many ways, a gentle scholar, and he said himself that he was really kind of more of a natural professor figure than a pope. But he was also very, very conservative. And for example, in taking the very traditional Catholic line on contraception, that will have had a real impact on women's lives in many parts of the world. So although I know one shouldn't speak ill of the dead, and I'm sure he was a very good man in many, many ways, we also shouldn't forget that the pronouncements of major religious figures, whether they are Catholic or Muslim fundamentalist or any other religion, do have a very, very real effect on the lives of people. I mean, we just have to look at what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment and how that's been taken over by people who don't believe in educating women. So yes, it's a sad day, but he was 95.
Sorry to interrupt, Christina. We've run short of time. Benedict, I'll come back to you another time on that. Thank you both very much